C'est avec une immense joie que l'équipe d'ASTRALFLIX vous présente cet entretien avec le fascinant Thomas Campbell. Cela a été un vrai travail d'équipe avec Hussein, Charles et bien d'autres pour couvrir des sujets aussi vastes que la définition de la conscience et son modèle de la réalité, la métaphysique, mais aussi bien sûr la physique du surnaturel, selon Tom, les techniques de sortir du corps, le développement des sons binauraux, le développement de l'intuition avec un grand I, l'impact de tout cela sur notre vie de tous les jours, mais aussi les éléments liés à l'histoire de Tom, les entités qui l'ont formé et accompagné durant son enfance, histoire qu'il partage d'ailleurs avec le non moins célèbre Robert Monroe, leurs rencontres, leurs premières expériences dans les années 70, parce qu'il faut savoir que l'œuvre de Thomas Campbell est indissociable de son histoire de vie. Son œuvre en 3 volumes, pour laquelle vous trouverez le lien en dessous de la vidéo, c'est My Big Toe, témoigne directement de ce lien biographique entre le modèle de la réalité proposé par Tom et son histoire de vie. Le My, entre guillemets, de My Big Toe n'est pas un caprice narcissique, mais bien le souhait de Tom de pousser chacun à faire sa propre expérience. Son modèle de la simulation est avant tout un modèle multijoueur, donc basé sur la pluralité et la singularité de chaque expérience individuelle de la réalité. C'est pour cette raison que nous avons choisi de commencer, pour les auditeurs francophones, avec une courte biographie qui permettra de bénéficier au maximum de l'échange qui suivra. Alors sans plus attendre, je laisse la parole à Charles.
Thomas Campbell aura 80 ans cette année. De 5 à 8 ans, des entités l'aidaient à sortir de son corps. On jouait, on s'amusait, mais il ne savait pas alors qu'il y avait un but caché à ces jeux. Et finalement, un jour, il va devoir passer un examen pour mesurer la qualité de son être. Avec une mauvaise blague, il a failli tout faire capoter. On recommence ses examens, il ne sait pas s'il a réussi ou pas, il se retrouve alors tout seul les jours suivants à sortir de son corps, pour finalement être bloqué par ses amis qui lui avaient dit que s'il continuait ainsi, il pourrait finir par être bizarre plus tard. Donc il perd peu à peu les souvenirs de toutes ses expériences, mais a de temps en temps, durant son adolescence, des conversations télépathiques. Il pensait que tout le monde avait ce genre de conversation avec des amis invisibles. Et de plus en plus, il finit par oublier tout ça pour commencer ses études où il prépare 2 diplômes, un de physique et un de mathématiques, en 68 à l'âge de 23 ans. 3 ans plus tard, en 71, il découvre la méditation transcendantale. Cela était intéressant pour un jeune étudiant comme lui, qui n'a pas beaucoup d'argent, d'améliorer sa concentration et de diminuer son besoin de sommeil. Mais il avait quand même un petit doute, il pensait que c'était un truc de hippie, et il se retrouve à méditer avec un mantra, des mots qui n'ont aucun sens, pendant 45 minutes sur une chaise, et son esprit dérive quelque part, c'est agréable, et il se rend compte qu'il ne peut plus bouger, il panique, il a failli tomber de sa chaise, et découvre qu'à chaque fois qu'il doit méditer, il se retrouve avec le même résultat, ce qui est troublant parce que personne ne médite comme lui. Mais il finit par avoir rapidement de meilleures performances au travail. Il peut trouver, c'est ce qu'il affirme, des bugs dans des programmes imprimés. Il suffit juste qu'il lise les feuilles et il va trouver l'erreur, donc il aide ses collègues. Il dort finalement peu et il est toujours en forme. Et des fois dans la journée, il se perd dans ses pensées. Les gens pensent qu'il dort, il est déjà un original. Avec une très bonne quand même réputation. Et il décroche assez rapidement un premier job dans sa spécialité. Un jour, son patron lui montre le livre de Robert Monroe, Voyage au-delà du corps, et lui demande ce qu'il en pense. Intéressé, en tant que scientifique, de vérifier les dires de l'auteur, il décide de se rendre chez Robert Monroe, qui habite à 45 minutes. La rencontre se passe très bien, tous les deux sont assez excentriques. Ils se parlent franchement, ce qui interpelle un peu les collègues et le patron. Ils n'ont pas vraiment conscience des conventions sociales. Et assez rapidement, il se trouve des points communs, et Robert Monroe est très intéressé à ce que des scientifiques viennent travailler chez lui pour démontrer les véracités scientifiques des sorties du corps. Donc Robert Thomas Campbell se porte volontaire avec son collègue Denis, qui est un ingénieur, et il réalise des expériences chez Monroe, qui les guide à l'aide d'un micro, alors qu'ils sont dans des caissons complètement isolés, seulement équipés d'un microphone et de haut-parleurs. Alors ils découvrent les sorties hors du corps. Robert Monroe veut absolument qu'ils apprennent à sortir de leur corps pour pouvoir vérifier d'eux-mêmes ces dires. Thomas et Denis vont finir par comprendre l'importance de la glande pinéale et de l'oscillation de 4 Hz pendant la sortie hors du corps. Un jour, Denis ramène à l'Institut Monroe le scientifique américain d'octobre 1973 dans lequel il y a un article sur les sons binauraux. Les sons binauraux, ce sont des sons qui n'ont pas la même fréquence, projetés dans un casque audio sur des personnes avec une différence de 4 Hz. Pour le cas cité dans l'article, il s'agit d'un son binauraux avec 100 Hz dans l'oreille gauche et 104 Hz dans l'oreille droite. On retrouve encore cette histoire des 4 Hz. Tout le monde sort avec ces sons binauraux. Ils vont finir par collecter des milliers d'heures d'exploration en projection de conscience sur des cassettes. La projection de conscience consiste à sortir de son corps, mais le corps reste réveillé, c'est-à-dire que l'on peut parler pendant qu'on est en sortie. Thomas et Denis finissent un jour par avoir une expérience extraordinaire dans laquelle ils sortent de leur corps, mais ils vont dans le même endroit et décrivent le même environnement, ce qui prouve l'objectivité de ce monde invisible. À partir de là, Thomas commence à avoir l'idée d'une théorie du tout et part de la structure d'un livre à succès de la médium Jane Roberts. Le livre s'appelle Seth Speaks en anglais, en français c'est Le livre de Seth, dans lequel Jane Roberts, qui est l'auteur, interroge une entité qui s'appelle Seth et sur la nature de la réalité, sur la nature de la médiumnité, sur la nature du temps, et cette entité lui répond. Et à travers ces questions-réponses, Thomas décide de vérifier par lui-même et avec Denis toutes les questions et les réponses qui ont été posées dans ce livre. De là sortira My Big Toe, sa grande théorie du tout, quelques années plus tard. Finalement, un jour, Robert Monroe raconte à Thomas qu'il a fait une sortie assez particulière dans laquelle il a été testé par des entités sur la qualité de sa conscience. Et Thomas Campbell se rappelle alors de son expérience dans sa jeunesse. Et il découvre avec stupeur qu'on lui a posé exactement les mêmes questions. Donc ils finissent par comprendre, Thomas et Robert, que tout le monde aura un jour à subir ce même test. Thomas va continuer à peaufiner dans les années qui vont suivre sa grande théorie du tout, et tout en étant en poste à la compagnie de services d'ingénierie spécialisée dans la recherche et développement de missiles de défense, et à aider un groupe de développement en qualité de conscience. Finalement, en 2003, il sort sa trilogie, My Big Toe, dans lequel il partage toutes ses connaissances. Cette trilogie se divise en 6 parties. La première regroupe son autobiographie jusqu'aux années Monroe, et les 5 autres parties, c'est la théorie à proprement parler, qui se veut une démarche logique sans biais culturel. Sa théorie part du Big Bang à aujourd'hui, la réalité des mondes invisibles, des univers parallèles, la nature de la réalité qui est principalement une simulation, la nature du temps, etc. Toutes les réponses à vos questions. La démarche se veut logique et sans biais culturel. Mais elle demande aussi une démarche de la part du lecteur. En effet, comme Thomas, il propose au lecteur de méditer 30 minutes le matin et 30 minutes le soir en répétant un mantra qui n'a aucun sens. Ceci afin de développer notre évolution spirituelle. L'idée, c'est de développer sa conscience, ce qui est le plus important. Tout repose aussi sur notre propre expérience. La preuve est la clé de la compréhension. Donc le but du jeu est de développer sa conscience tout en étant scientifique dans sa démarche. Si on voulait résumer le livre, je dirais qu'il y a 2 prémices logiques. L'évolution est un processus fondamental et la conscience est la source unique. Mais Thomas sera mieux à même de vous expliquer tout ça.
Okay.
That's good.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you really on behalf of the ASTRALFLIX community and all the French community. Your books are translated in French. It's excellent translation. I have one here.
Ah, good, good. Did you read both English and French?
Yes, yes.
Oh, so good. I'm glad to hear that. I haven't the French books haven't sold very many, so I haven't heard a lot of comments from them. So if you say it's a good translation, that makes me feel better.
So so maybe after this interview, the people will
We'll buy more of them. Yeah, yeah.
no, it's a great translation, and what I've noticed is that it's clear that your work and your personal journey are intertwined, and
Yes.
we can see it from the title of your book. It's My Big Toe. That it really drives home that point. So I would love to dive into your story a bit.
Huh?
And if you don't mind, I'd love to outline a brief biography, but and focusing on some specific events that shaped the backbone of your model.
Okay.
And
Okay.
then
So
maybe,
you just ask the questions, and I'll try to give you the best answers I can. But if you think I'm taking too much time with an answer or something, you can just jump in. Don't be shy. You're the interviewer. You're in charge. You take it where you want it to go. You hit the subjects you want to hit because you know your audience much better than I do.
Okay, great. So just before we jump into the bio, let's touch at something quite fundamental, I think. In your theory of everything, where does your perspective fit in relation to others? Because you explain it in the beginning of the book, the first book. How do you envision others incorporating this understanding, and is direct experience of this model a key for understanding it?
How do others come into the picture? Well, there's quite a stir these days talking about virtual reality, and my book eventually does end up a book talking about the source of this reality is a computer. This is a computed reality, a virtual reality, a simulation, and that has attracted a lot of attention because physicists these days know that our reality is information-based, not mass-based. They know that from quantum physics, but they don't know what to do after that. They get to that point, and the next step is not clear. Where do you go with that? Computed where? Computed for what reason? Computed how? And it can't be computed here because a virtual reality doesn't compute itself. A virtual reality is computed from elsewhere, someplace else. So now that posits, some other reality system other than our physical reality as a more fundamental place than our physical reality. And that is just places that physicists can't go. That sounds more like philosophy or theology or something else. So they're stuck, and they've been stuck like that for 100 years. Ever since quantum physics became quantum physics, back with Born and Planck and Schrodinger and all the guys who made quantum physics happen, they all realized that consciousness was fundamental. Consciousness was the key, but they didn't know how to take the step beyond that. And with my book, I do take that step, and I do explain what is primary and what is computing this virtuality and why this virtual reality is being computed. And what does that mean? And what does that mean to us? And what's our role in all of this? And who are we? So I answer all those questions. And as far as I know, there isn't anybody else worldwide that has the same model or who has arrived at the same conclusion. So I'm unique in that sense. The reason that I'm unique is that you can't get there purely from a physics viewpoint, which I just explained, you get stuck. You very quickly are out of the realm of physics when you try to figure out how this virtual reality is computed. Well, that's because physics has defined itself into a corner of being just the science of the objective world. And that leaves the whole subjective world outside of science, outside of physics. The whole subjective world is outside of chemistry and pretty much even outside of biology. It's just outside of science, which is very unfortunate because that subjective world is the biggest part of our world. You know, most of the things that matter in our lives are not objective. You know, should I marry Sally or should I marry Sue? You know, what's the meaning of justice? What's love all about? You know, what does freedom really mean, you know, to people? All that's subjective. Well, those are the things that are important. That's the stuff that's significant to most people's lives. Love, family, caring, belonging, connecting, helping, you know, it's all subjective. So if you say the only thing that matters, and you know, the only thing that matters is this objective reality, the stuff, well, that's like going to a play and say the only thing that matters is the props. You know, don't worry about the actors and all the stuff they're saying. You know, that's not important. The only thing that's important is the props. Well, that's silly. Obviously, the subjective world is a very important world. And this model of mine not only derives a better physics, you know, a better understanding of the objective world, but it drives also a understanding of the subjective world.
It's not only a theory of everything, it's also a theory of everything else, as to quote Jacques Vallée.
Yes, it's a theory of everything. It truly is. So it creates a new science of the subjective. So now you can understand why you're frustrated or why you're happy or why you're miserable or why life is a struggle. It all has to do with fear and the struggle between fear and love going on, you know, inside you. That's the key dynamic inside the subjective world. So anyway, this all comes out of it. So I'm pretty much a singularity in the world of physics, a singularity in the world of philosophy, a singularity in the world of theology, and a singularity in the world of metaphysics. All of those, you know, all of those areas, and a singularity in the world of actually the paranormal. Because in my model, the paranormal is just normal. Yeah. It's just the nature of consciousness, and that you and I, are not human beings. The human being is an avatar that we play. And we are pieces of consciousness. And that's our, you know, that's our root. That's who we are. We're pieces of consciousness playing a human being in a virtual reality created by consciousness. Consciousness is the computer. Consciousness is an information system. So that's kind of the, you know, in a nutshell, that's what the model comes to. Now, that may seem kind of wild and crazy to the listener who hasn't, you know, done the work to understand where that comes from. But that's actually extremely logical, has no assumptions other than one, that consciousness exists, and it's entirely logical, and it produces a better physics. It explains quantum physics. It explains why the speed of light is a constant in our reality. It explains all those things that physics can't explain, and it explains them perfectly logically. And it explains all the paranormal things and why they work, why they sometimes don't work, you know, how they work, their point, their purpose. And then it explains things like, you know, intention and morality, what's right, what's wrong, and, you know, how one can know the difference. So all of that comes out of this model, and it all comes out as science and logic. So, but you have to do the work to be able to see the paradigm shift. It's a pretty big paradigm shift from a material reality where the immaterial or the subjective reality is undefined and doesn't actually seem to be of value, The scientists all say, oh, that's just people hallucinating. That doesn't mean anything. There is no such thing as really a subjective mind.
Yes.
That's a hallucination. Well, that hallucination is in where we live most of our lives and find most of our meaning, and it's not a hallucination. That's the real deal. So that's kind of in a nutshell where I'm coming, but it's a big step in paradigm shift. And most people look at it, oh, we're a virtual reality computed by consciousness. That sounds ridiculous. So they don't deal with it because it's too big a paradigm shift for them to make that stretch. But if you start at the beginning and follow the logic, you'll make the paradigm shift because it's all logic. There's no belief involved. As a matter of fact, belief is the enemy of making this shift. Beliefs get in the way. Beliefs just not only distract you, but they keep you from learning. If you believe then you won't take the trouble to actually find out. So that's kind of in a nutshell where I am. Now, I guess you also maybe want me to talk a little bit about where I came from.
Yeah, but just before we dive in this, I think because of your kind of singularity, we can get to your model and your theory from the left brain side or the intuitive side. You've opened the field so much everybody can get in.
That is exactly right. Yeah, I wrote the book as what I call an on-ramp for the left brainers, for the logical process people, the scientists, the engineers. Because those people don't have an on-ramp. Yeah. If you give some kind of a scientist or engineer or a mathematician or even a businessman or a doctor, people who deal in logical process, if you give those people, say, the Bhagavad Gita, they'll read the first 10 pages and say, what the hell does this mean? And they'll put it down and throw it away because it's poetry. Yeah. And poetry has to be interpreted, and there's no guide to how to interpret it. So it just it's meaningless. Mine does not have to be interpreted. Matter of fact, do not interpret what I say. Listen, read what I say. It's logical. Just follow the logic. You don't have to interpret it. It's not poetry. So that's a big difference. Now, the right brain people, the people who are very intuitive, they have lots of ways to get to this larger reality. There's lots of books written for intuitive people. They can get there. Yeah, all sorts of things. They can read the Bhagavad Gita. They can, if they don't understand the metaphor, they can make up a metaphor that works for them now and change it later. People with logical process can't do that. Making up metaphors is just like making up stuff and going down la la land. It's not allowed. So the intuitive people, which we'll call the right brain people who don't need logic, they kind of leap over logic to conclusions with their intuition. These people love it because though they don't need the logic, the my big toe gives them credibility. They read about it and they say, oh, I knew that, but I didn't understand why it was like that. I knew I could do this, or I knew that this existed, but it was always, am I just making this up? Or is this am I having just hallucinations or what? They never have confirmation that what they're doing is actually logical and part of a science. And people always call them airheads and, they don't pay much attention to intuitive people, the right brain people. So this then puts them on the map. They say, oh, this thing that you've been doing all your life intuitively, it's a real thing. It exists, and it's just like you thought it was. It does work like that, and you got it right. And here's why it works that way. Here's the logic that explains it. It's actually a part of science. And then they go, finally. Yeah. Finally, I'm not just the crazy person, and I see that my craziness has logic and has science behind it. So both the right brain and the left brain generally really like my books because the right brain finally gets an explanation and confirmation, and the left brain has an on-ramp, a way that they can actually get to understand those things that they know nothing about and that are the most important segment of their, of their lives.
Yeah, they can start to experience and to experience firsthand this 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 phenomenon. So I'd like to start with the childhood. I'm really interested in childhood and how these experiences, especially out of body experience, how it relates to childhood. You had spontaneous experiences between the age of 5 and 8, I think. You also mentioned non-physical friends.
Yes, had those too.
In the interview with I think Mark Cherto, you spoken about a friend you called Big G, or it's really interesting because I was wondering how do you know that all children experience frequent astral travel, and how these fade away naturally over time, and how should we approach this with children? For example, for your own, and in your childhood, and with your own son, for example, how did you manage to?
Okay, how do you know that not only children, but most adults also experience out of body? Well, we call it out of body. That's a terrible name for it. You're not in your body. It's not getting out of your body. That's not how it works at all. But that's just the words that people have picked a long time ago out of ignorance to call it. Back in the day, they thought there was a spirit that lived in your body, and then the spirit got out of your body and flew around in spirit land. It's not like that at all. But that's the name, so that's what we'll use. Everybody does that, more or less. And here's the way you can kind of tell an out of body from a dream, because most of them happen to people at night, while they're asleep. A dream will disappear very quickly. If you've had a dream, you wake up and it's clear. 2 minutes later, it's fuzzy. 2 minutes after that, you can barely remember it. And 5 minutes after that, you remember just a piece or two of it, but none of it really makes sense to you anymore. That's a dream. An out of body is a regular experience, just like any other experience, just like you going out of your house and taking a walk and being bitten by a dog. That's an experience. And you'll remember that experience always. If you were, 6 years old, or if you were 66 years old, you'll remember the day you got out of your house, you walked down the street and got bitten by a dog. That's an experience. We remember experiences like that if they have any significance or meaning to them. We have memory for those. If they have no significance, then we often forget them, but they're actually still in there someplace. They're just hard to pull up. An out of body is a regular experience. It's you as consciousness experiencing something, and it sticks with you. It doesn't go away. So those times that you wake up from a dream, and the next day you still remember it, and 2 weeks later you still remember it, and you can even go back and say, yeah, I can remember when I was 8 years old, I used to have this dream of such and such a thing. Well, those dreams are probably out of body experiences, because otherwise you would have forgotten them. So that is one way to tell. Now, it's not a perfect way, because all out of body experiences are not necessarily dramatic and meaningful.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're not all that meaningful either. So you don't particularly remember anything about it, even though it was an out of body, because it was not that interesting an experience. So, but if you do have one of those dreams that you remember, that probably wasn't a dream at all. That was an out of body experience. Now, you can watch somebody as they go through this transition. You can kind of be with them. So it's a thing you can measure if you're sensitive enough to to be with them in that as consciousness. Children do it a lot. Children come to this world with a lot of intuition. It takes them up to about the age of 7 before we beat most of that intuition out of them, telling them to stop making stuff up. There are no invisible friends. Don't waste your time, dreaming and imagining things. So we kind of get that out of them by about 7 years old. And we force them to do a lot of logical process stuff like reading and math. And we force them to do that. And if they do that, that eventually kind of squeezes out their intuitive side down to a very small thing. But make no mistake, your 3-year-olds and your 4-year-olds, they know intuitively a whole lot more than you think they know. They can read your feelings. They can read, if you're upset or not upset or angry or sad or any other kind of a strong emotion. They know it. Even if you keep the straight face and put a smile on that face that doesn't actually belong there, you think you're tricking the world. You may trick the adults, but you're not tricking the kids. They know exactly what you're feeling. And for that fact, most of the more intelligent dogs do too. They work in that area of feeling in an intuitive mental space because they don't have a large intellectual space. So when you're 3 years old, your intuitive side is much better developed than it is when you're 10 years old. And by the time you're 15 or 16 or 18 or 20, your intuitive side is almost, dried up and gone away. It's very little because you never use it. You don't try to develop it. You just let it sit there and it atrophies. There's always the potential. You can develop it later, but you just don't develop it. So we sometimes get intuition that things happen. We get this gut feeling, but they're wrong about as much as they're right. They're not all that reliable. Whereas if you develop your intuition can turn out to be, I'll say, just as reliable, just as accurate, just as consistent as anything you get through your intellect. Matter of fact, that's an undersell, just because otherwise most people wouldn't believe me. It actually is more reliable, more accurate, and more on the point than what you normally get out of your intellect. Because the intellect does logic, but for logic, you need information. Logic's a great tool, but logic consumes a lot of information. All right, should I marry Sally or marry Sue? What's the logic? Well, where's the information? Well, there is no information if you don't have a crystal ball that tells you all the things that'll happen over the next 20 years if you marry Sally or marry Sue. So there is no information. Most all the important things in our life, we don't have the information, so we can't be logical. So we guess. We take our best guess and do what we think, what feels right. And if we had developed our intuition, we could look at the probable future database and get some idea of what is likely to happen in both of those cases. Likely, not that will happen, but just likely to happen in each of those cases. How do things will work out? Will we be happy and still interacting in a very positive way 2 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later? And you can get the probabilities on that because those probabilities exist within the consciousness system. The system is based on probability and statistics. It's not based from the ground up on, it's not that kind of simulation. It's not a simulation that you take the tiniest particles and make bigger particles, which make bigger particles, and eventually you get, into the macro world of molecules. It doesn't work like that. It has a rule set, which is mostly deterministic, not entirely, but mostly deterministic. But then that rule set generates all sorts of probabilities based on history, on expectation, what's been done before. And those probabilities form a database of the future. It's all the things that are possible and what the probabilities of each one of those possibilities are. And that data is available to you. So the funny thing is, if you're intellectual, you've got logic, but the data you have to put into that logic machine is really ratty and not, and sketchy.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're over on the intuitive side, you have all this very precise information, but the tool you're using instead of logic is your intuition. And it's a ratty tool. The reason it's a ratty tool is that it depends on how you feel. It depends on your attitude. It depends on what you ate for dinner. It depends on the state of your health. It depends on all kinds of things, because the consciousness who's playing the avatar can only play the avatar in as much as the rule set allows. In other words, there's a rule set that defines the virtual reality.
Mm-hmm.
And if that avatar has been eating too much sugar, or is not in good health, or confused because of stuff he's done to himself, taking drugs or other things, then the consciousness has to deal with an avatar that's mostly dysfunctional. So it's not that the consciousness is always in a perfectly clean and wonderful state to do whatever it wants. It depends on that avatar.
Mm-hmm.
It can only do the things that avatar allows, and that avatar only allows what's according to the rule set. So it's if you have an avatar that just has one arm, then the consciousness has to play a one-armed avatar. It's limited into what it can do. So that's just the nature of the way things work. And so if you don't take good care of your body, and if your mind isn't clear, and you haven't gotten rid of your fears and all the other things that interfere with clarity of your mind, then your avatar is working with a mush of dysfunctional junk that's going on. It has to work with that. That's the best it can, but that it's very limited in what it can do. So you get rid of all that junk, and now the consciousness is like, it's open. It can work on all sorts of different levels. It can work on the level of consciousness. It can work and do so much more. So in that intuitive space, you can actually be more accurate, more concise, and more precise with the information you can get there than you can through logic. Because logic, unless it's a very trivial problem, logic never has enough information to solve it.
I also noticed that from the intuitive side, you have integrated understanding of the situation, and from the logical side, it's either black or white. It's not. In the intuitive side, you can have all the nuances of gray.
That tends to be the case. The intuitive side is a much deeper, richer database than the intellectual side. The intellectual side, it's this way. This is the way it is. And these are the possibilities. And these are the routes that connect, the present to the future. It's all kind of sterile.
Yeah.
The same thing goes for the props. You go to a play and you just look at the props. That's pretty sterile. There's not a lot going on there. It's just the props. They're sterile. They're interesting, and they tell a lot, and they give mood, and they give character, and they set the story. I mean, it's not that they're not important. They're very important. But if that's why you go to the play, is to sit and watch this, it becomes a very sterile play. There's not a lot of sensitivity. There's not a lot of give and take in it. It's not until the consciousness comes on that all of the interesting stuff starts to happen. So it's the same way. With consciousness, you have nuance, and you have much more depth and many other possibilities. And with the stuff, it's just the stuff. You can catalog it, you can weigh it, you can measure it, and then once you've done that, you can admire it, you can use it, but it's not very. It doesn't give you many. It doesn't give you much. Yeah. In the intuitive side, that's where love is. That's where caring is. That's where justice is. That's where peace is. All these things are not stuff.
It
They're all
opens
mental things.
your decision space and your understanding space. It's much more broad and diverse.
Exactly.
I really would like to dive into this subject of the non-physical, the friends, but also these non-physical that you had uh, like a standardized test when you were a child, and I would like to understand which type of non-physical it was, which interaction you could have, and um, how to how to understand or to feel the trustworthiness of information when we deal with non-physicals.
Okay. That takes time. You have to develop this intuition. Just like most of us, anybody listening to this is probably, let's say the people are, 50 years old or 40 years old. Well, for almost that long, they've been developing their intellect, honing it, polishing it, getting more information, understanding what that information means. And people develop that intellect over years and years and years. And then you can imagine like the story of, boy raised by wolves. He can't speak. He doesn't understand almost anything. He understands, maybe fear, run away, attack. That's just about his whole repertoire of things to do. So he has very, very little understanding because he hasn't developed his intellect. So with intellect comes language, comes all sorts of things. And, that takes many, many years to develop. And we're still doing it. You're 70 years old. You're still reading. You're still finding things out. You're still discovering. Your intellect is constantly being honed and refined and added to. Well, what about your intuitive side? Nada, nothing. You're not doing anything generally to add to that, to increase it, to hone it, to develop it. So it also takes time, just like the intellect takes time. You can't take the boy that was raised by wolves and turn him into a normal boy that you can send off to school. That's going to take some years to do that. He's got to learn language. He's got to learn to interact with other human beings. He's got to learn a lot of stuff. And it's not going to be teach him in a week how to act like a normal human child. So it's the same with your intuitive side. It takes a lot of time and a lot of practice to develop that. In the beginning, it seems impossible. It seems ratty. It seems, you get wrong answers more than you get right answers. You're not doing it right. And it takes a lot of practice to do it. But eventually you get some positive feedback and things do start to work. So then you do it a little more. And you should always learn from, if you come back from a trip into the intuitive world, you need to think about it and say, what was important? What wasn't important? What meant what? What was symbolic? What was metaphoric? What was literal? And what did it all mean? And why did I get that? Why was that significant for me? And why is it significant for, my future? And other than just take the experiences, what we do now, we just kind of throw them away. Yeah, it's just an experience. Just a dream, just an out of body, just an intuitive thing that we got, but we don't give it much credibility. We don't work with it. We don't accumulate understanding with it. But yes, it does take time. It's not quick. But like I say, if you take the time to develop it, you'll find that intuitive side is much more knowledgeable than your intellectual side. And it's more accurate and it's more reliable. When you first start, it's none of those things. It's not reliable, it's not accurate, and you would not be, good to depend on it because you're just learning to develop it. and understand it. And it is not quick, but it's probably just as quick as developing your intellect. In some years, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you can develop a pretty decent intellect that'll get you by as a 7-year-old. There's still a lot of stuff you don't know, but all the basics you kind of have, and in 7 years you could probably get most of the basics of an intuitive side.
And you developed such a tool to develop the intuitive side. It's Tom Spark.
I developed 2 tools. One of them is Tom Spark. And I developed Tom Spark for people who were very left brain and had a real hard time getting their intellect to sit down and be quiet while they develop their intuitive side. What happens is, in our culture, we develop that intellect and we put that intellect in charge. Now you try to develop your intuitive side, and your intuitive side goes off to develop itself, and that intellect jumps right inside, jumps right in the middle of the intuitive side's game and tells the intuitive side what to do, takes over. So that doesn't work. Your intuitive side is not your intellectual side, and your intellectual side cannot explain, how it is to be intuitive. Your intellectual side doesn't understand intuition. That's a non-rational thing. Intuition's not rational. It's not logical. It's beyond logic. And the intellect wants to take over. So many people who are unbalanced, and that is, they have a much stronger intellectual side than they have intuitive side. So they're way out of balance. That intellectual side just runs roughshod over their small intuitive side. And that prevents them from learning. That prevents that intuitive side from growing up. It's like the intuitive side has an older brother that every time it stands up, the older brother comes over and smashes it back out again. It's that kind of thing. So yes, the Tom Spark was meant for people like that who were challenged to get into that intuitive side, embrace it, and work with it, and keep the intellect. Just sit down and let me work with this intuitive side for a while. Don't butt in. So it was almost impossible for them. The intuitive side and the intellectual side just was always right there, right, wanting to take charge. So Tom Spark is a way that you can get to the same spaces, the same intuitive information without ever learning how to meditate, without ever going through the rigor and the discipline of disciplining that intellect and making it sit down and be quiet. That's what meditation is all about. It's disciplining your intellect. It's also disciplining your intuitive side. It's a mental discipline. It says you must sit still and quiet and have no thoughts. That's meditation. No thoughts. And your intellect will say, "Oh, what do you mean by no thoughts?" Which, of course, is a thought. And you say, "Intellect, be quiet." And the intellect says, "Why should I be quiet?" It's just really hard to get that intellect to get down, because it wants an intellectual reason for everything. What good is it to sit down and have no thoughts? If you can't explain that to me intellectually, then, I'm not going to let you do it. It's that sort of thing. Well, you can't explain that intellectually because it's irrational. The intuitive side is an irrational side, but it's a very important part of being conscious. The intellectual and logical side is also a very important part, but it's just half the story. The other half of the story is over on the intuitive side. All the paranormal things happen on the intuitive side. None of them happen on the intellectual side. They're all intuitive. So if you want to experience those things, you want to experience the larger reality, you want to be able to get around inside of the consciousness world, you need to get your intellect to just sit down and be quiet and leave you alone for a year or two while you practice and develop your intuitive side. And Tom Spark then lets you get there without ever going through the meditation, which is the standard practice for trying to get your intellect to be quiet, trying to get your mind to shut up and just be aware without having anything to say or without trying to be logical about it. So that's it's another process for the really left brain. You know, it helps them get through it. And the thing I use there as a tool is imagination. We don't realize it because being intellectuals and being materialists, we throw imagination away. That's a trash part of the mind. Okay, you can imagine things, part of the mind's ability, but all this stuff, that's just trash. You know, amusing sometimes, might make good stories in a book, but there's no real substance to it. But the imagination is a very powerful part of your consciousness, very powerful part of your consciousness, and it's something that's tied directly to your intuitive side. So it's a good place to start, and you can forget about meditation altogether and go, and you can enter the realm of consciousness through your imagination as well as through meditation. Both are doorways that you can use. So that's Tom's part. But the other thing I have is I have a product that I sell. It's something like Exploring Consciousness with Tom Campbell. And what that does is works with your intellect. It says, okay, intellect, I'm going to teach you about paranormal things. And I'm going to ask you to sit down and be quiet just for a very short time while I do something paranormal, where I experience something paranormal. And it explains the paranormal. How does it work? Why does it work? What are the things that prevent it from working? And then I set up situations where you get to practice, and almost everybody that takes it will have some success with it. They'll do some things that are paranormal. And I have that course because that's an eye-opener. When somebody does their first really good remote view, well, that changes them. You know, it's like, oh, this really is possible. You can do that. You can see what's going on someplace else or in a picture that you've never looked at. And when they do it themselves, then it's their truth. If they read about it, it's somebody else's truth. So that's why I call it my big two, because if it's my experience, my book's written from my experience. You have to have your own experience. My truth is not your truth. You have to find your own truth in your own experience. And I tell people that don't try to become me. Don't go down that path. Try to become who you are. Be an authentic person and develop your own intuition, develop your own truth through your own experience. And that's important. So I have this course that you take. It's like a 5-day course, but you can take it over as many days as you want. You can buy it on Soundwise. It's an audio course. What happened there is I produced maybe 20 or 40 or 50 of these courses were actually brick and mortar courses where I'd go someplace, people would come, and we'd spend 5 days getting them to experience the paranormal. And friends of mine, Donna and Keith, took all of that and boiled it down to one audio course that you can take in your home at your own time. It's got all the binaural beats with it. So I recommend, for people that say, oh, that's a lot of nonsense, take the course. If you actually do the course and do it seriously, you will probably do some paranormal things. And you'll surprise yourself. It's not that hard. You know, healing another person with your mind sounds like an outrageous thing to do. And if you could do it, you'd think it'd be very difficult. Only the very few could ever do something like that. It's one of the easiest paranormal things to do because there's so much uncertainty in biology. And what you're doing when you heal is you're just modifying future probability with your intention. Intention changes future probability to some extent. It doesn't manipulate it completely, but it modifies it. So it's an easy thing to learn. You can be successful at healing people in 3 months if you practice. So it's just, not that hard. So if you think this is all a pile of crap and, it couldn't possibly be true. Well, go do it. Make it your truth. Yeah, I would agree with you. Don't believe me. My truth means nothing to you.
Yes.
It has to be your own truth.
It's faster than medical studies. I've experienced I've experienced both. Uh,
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm really interested. I would like you to tell us the story of your meeting with Bob Monroe and the early days of the lab, the risky experiences you was doing there and testing, but also your relation with Dennis Menrick and this friendship and the things you explored together. I think that this period from the 70s to the 80s, maybe, it's interesting.
Well, I should just start first and say when I was, as you mentioned, when I was like 5, 6 years old, I had some non-physical friends that I talked with, and some of these, I just called them. Well, I now call them. I don't know what I called them then, but they were just entities, that I ran into. Well, some entities came one night and asked me if I wanted to experience being able to fly, get out of my body and go places. And of course I said, sure, sounds like fun. So they did. And they actually made the process happen. So there I was out of my body. And they said, well, go ahead, play, have an intention, intend to do something. So I intended to float right out of the bed, through the room, through the window that was closed, and outside. And I did. I just floated right out the window and right outside. And then I thought, oh, this is cool. So I went down to the ground, stood on the ground, and then that's the yard that I played in all the time. So I wanted to see if I could run right through the hedge, so I could run right through the hedge into the neighbor's yard. And I always kind of wondered what was in that yard because I wasn't allowed to go in there, but now I was in there through the hedge and in the yard, and I looked around, and anyway, it was just fun. I could float, I could go up, I could fly, and it was all about intent. What you intended, if you had a strong enough intent, that's what you would do. It was all with intent. So they gathered me back in, and the next night they came, and then we did that 4, 5, 6 times. They were just trying to get me interested, hook me on the experience so that I would develop a desire to learn how to do this. Eventually, I demanded that they teach me how to do it. Otherwise, I was depending on them to come and do that for me. And they tried to talk me out of that. They wanted to stay in the loop. They didn't want me to go off on my own, but I demanded, so they let me do it. And I didn't like it. It was a real extreme experience, which I later realized they just did that on purpose so that I wouldn't get independent too soon. It really doesn't have to be an extreme experience. But eventually I got independent anyway and started exploring and doing things. So I had that going on at a young age. And at some point, they shut it off. And they said, we don't want you to learn too much or get too weird such that you're out of place in the regular world. They didn't want me to end up in an institution for little boys who see things that aren't there, So they said, you got enough. You don't want you to be too weird. You won't fit in. So they stopped it, locked me out. I tried to go back anyway and couldn't do it. They had me locked out. So then fast forward all the way up to the time I'm in graduate school. And when I'm in graduate school, I learned how to meditate because the meditation poster said, learn how to meditate and get by with less sleep. And I'm a graduate student in nuclear physics, and I have this big Van de Graaff generator that has to run and smash atoms together and get results out the other end. And that thing was a big clunky old thing that would sometimes run and sometimes didn't. It needed a lot of repair. So when that thing was running, you stayed there and took data, whether that means you stopped sleeping or not. So if it was going to run for 2 or 3 days, which is about what you needed worth of data, you'd stay up for 2 or 3 days getting that data. So I thought, I need something that will help me get by with less sleep. So I took this transcendental meditation, and it was just a natural. I could just do it very, very easily. And I was only about 3 or 4 months into that, where I was doing it, like they said, like 20 minutes a day, and so on. And I was just playing with it. And I pulled up my what do we call it? The printout. We have at computers, you have printouts. Well, these are the old days where you punch cards and you got these printouts, and I'd look at my cards. I had like 3 boxes of cards, and you could put like 1,100 cards in a box or something. So I had 3,000-4,000 cards in these boxes, and I was having a problem with the machine wouldn't run it. And in those days, there was no debug information. You put your job in, and it either ran or it didn't. And when it didn't, it stopped. And that was it. Nothing got printed out and said, here's why we stopped, or, you might want to check this or that or whatever. You put print statements in it so that it would print something. And you always knew that if that print came out, then it was somewhere after that last print statement. That's how you debugged your stuff, which was gross compared to the kind of, eloquent debug stuff they have now. But anyway, so I was looking for errors on these cards. And I just let my mind wander to the cards. And there it was. It just popped up in front of me, all my cards. And they were just scrolling by. And some of them were bright red. And I thought, those are the ones with errors on them. So I'd looked at them, memorized the card, because I punched every one of those cards. So I was very familiar with it. So I picked them all out. I went back to my cards the next day and found out that indeed all the cards that I'd seen read had errors on them. Little errors, you forgot to put a comma at the end of the line or some other kind of little error that made it work. But there was a couple that didn't have any errors on them. I couldn't find an error. So I fixed all the ones where I found the errors. The others I let alone because I just couldn't find errors. I thought something was wrong. I put it back in and it bombed. So I said, well, I'll repunch those cards. And I did. Nothing seemed to be wrong with them, but I repunched them, got rid of those cards and repunched them. They ran just fine. Those cards, the card punches is a mechanical thing. And all mechanical things get out of line and off center and move a little bit over time. And every once in a while, the card punches would punch off center. And when they did, the computer would refuse to read it. It was an unknown character. It would bomb your job. So that's what was going on. So now that couldn't have been something out of my subconscious that knew that comma wasn't where it was supposed to be. This was a card punch error that nobody could have told. It was probably a fraction of a millimeter, too far to the right or something. And to the computer, it was it was not allowed. So just repunching the cards fixed the problem. And that happened all the time. Card punches would go wrong. People wouldn't be able to get their jobs run. People would come in and realign the card punches. And so it's just a thing you had to deal with back in those days. Anyhow, so that told me that I was getting information, had nothing to do with what might have been in my subconscious or anybody else's subconscious. This was real paranormal information that was true. It was correct. And it was absolutely impossible that I could have gotten this, but I did. So I started doing it more often. And I got to where I was really good at debugging my code because I had this tool that would point out where the errors were, just like everybody has now. 50 years later, everybody has debug tools that says, it's in this line, and I had something almost as good as that. People started asking me to help them debug their code because I was a wizard at debugging code. And anyhow, that's where it started. And at that point, I thought, well, I'm a physicist. What physicists do is we model reality. We make mathematical models of reality, how reality works. And I said, there's another whole part of reality that I don't know anything about. And it's not physical. It's entirely mental, but it's still a part of reality. It's something that's real. It has its own rules. It's not random. So if it's not random, then it has rules. It has processes. And I'm able to use it in this one instance, but that's just like, my awareness has fallen into a new realm. And all I know is just a few little details about this realm, just what I've run into. So I made it a point to try to figure out more about it. I'm a physicist. I want to know, what is it? What else can you do in this realm? It's the realm of the mental, it seems. And how does that differ? Does it have its own rules? Is it anything like the physical world, or does it mirror the physical world? Or does it have information that has nothing to do with the physical world in it as well? So I had that in my mind as something I someday wanted to explore, had no idea how to explore it. And then I got out of graduate school, went to work, and my boss tossed a book to me that was called Journeys Out of the Body by Bob Monroe. And he said, Tom, read this, tell me what you think. I read it, and I said, boss, if this guy's just making up stories, he's very creative. If he's just trying to sell books, then he's a pretty good writer. Pretty interesting story. But how do you know whether it's real or not? How do you know whether it's genuine? Is he really having these experiences, or is this just a psyche gone a little wacko, and he's making things up in his mind? How can you tell? And there's no way to tell. And if you can't tell, well, then you just can't come to any conclusions about it. So he agreed that's about where he had gotten with it as well. And he and some of his friends got together to find out where Bob Monroe actually lived. Turned out he was only about an hour away from where we were. And we went to see him to find out, is this guy a magician, or is he a psychic, or is he just somebody that's hustling books? So we went out to his house to see, and I met him and found out that he was just a very straightforward guy. And he had things called out-of-body experiences. As a matter of fact, that was his name. He named it out-of-body. And that he had played with it and tested it and found it to be real to his own test. As far as he was concerned, there was no question as to whether this was a real thing he was experiencing, not a hallucination, but something outside himself that was real. So he said he was wealthy. So he said he was in the process. He just finished actually building a lab. He wanted to study consciousness because he wanted some scientific help to put this experience on the scientific map. He says, I don't like being the weird guy that has weird experiences. I want this to be science. I want it to be something understandable. He says, I know it is, but I can't explain it. Somebody else will have to do that, but I'm making a lab where we're going to try to explain it. So he did. And I said, well, hey, if you're making a lab, I'll come. I'll be part of your lab because I've also had this experience and I'm trying to figure out how it works as well. And another friend who was in another department for me, he was an electrical engineer, Dennis Menrick. He says, I'll come too. He says, I've been, meditating in something for some years and I'm interested. I want to know how this stuff works too. So we then started going out to Bob's lab. And at first, it was Bob teaching us what he knew about out of body. Because we told Bob, if we just study you and what you do, that won't mean anything to us. That won't be really what we're after. We need to understand it in our own experience before we'll be able to make anything useful out of it. Your experience is nice for you, but it doesn't help us learn anything. So he agreed. He started to teach us.
I'm really interested in this part. You as a beginner in this area. Not a beginner because at 5 years old, you was already doing it, but...
Right. So Dennis and I started taking lessons, and probably I don't know, it didn't take very long. It's not actually very hard to do. It didn't take all that long. Probably by the end of a year, we were both going out of body on demand when we wanted to. We'd get in there and Bob would go through his little routine, but he really didn't need to do that anymore. We were beyond needing that. And we'd go out and Bob would give us targets, things to do. Because Dennis and I both, electrical engineer and a physicist, we thought that if this turns out to be a lot of hocus pocus, we just quit. You know, we don't have to stay here. But if it's real, we don't want to pass up the opportunity to learn something. So we stayed very skeptical, and we wanted to do things that were evidential. You know, we didn't want to go out and meet non-physical people, because how can you tell that from a hallucination? Yeah. There's nothing to grab hold of there, you know? So we wanted to do things, which means we mostly did things like remote viewing. Bob would give us coordinates, or he'd you know, open up a page of a book and say, here, you know, I've got my finger right below a word. What is that word? You know, and we'd have to read it, or things like that. Write numbers on the board we were supposed to read. Go to you know, we'd go to some of our own friends' houses. We'd look around, see what they were doing, see if there was anything unusual there, and then we'd call them up if we found something unusual. If we said, oh yeah, they're sitting there watching TV, well, that wasn't worth a call. That's what most everybody did in those days, you know. But if you said, oh, there's a pair of bright red shoes sitting right in the middle of the bed, then you call them up. And you said, do you have a pair of bright red shoes sitting in the middle of your bed? And most of the time they would say, yeah, how did you know? So we had to get evidence. Dennis and I, you know, we're scientists, we're techies, we want evidence. So we spent a couple of years just getting evidence. So that's what we did. We did it hundreds, we did it thousands of times, going places, finding out what was in those places. Is it what we saw or not what we saw? Reading numbers on boards, trying to read what the newspaper headline was going to be, you know, next week. A week later, what's the headline going to be?
And you was doing this on the evenings, or?
In the evenings, yes. Dennis and I had full-time jobs. Dennis and I both had wives and young children. And in the evenings, after supper, about, you know, well, I don't know, 6 o'clock, I'd get my motorcycle and I'd go pick up Dennis. Dennis would hop on the back and we'd go out to where Bob Monroe lived on a motorcycle. It wasn't an hour away. It was only about 45 minutes away. Yeah. And we'd go there and we'd go in the lab and we'd start working, because we were building equipment. We wanted to set up GSR equipment to see if our skin resistance changed. We got hold of an old encephalograph, EEG, to put on your head, and as much equipment as we could get. We got a real high impedance voltmeter that would show tiny little fluctuations in voltage on a body. So we tried to wire the booths up with this equipment so we could see if there was any physical things that we could relate to it. And we did find one very strong physical thing, and that there was this thing we called the pulsation state, where you would feel like your body was just shaking at about 4 hertz. 4 hertz, that means 4 cycles per second. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, about like that. That's 4 hertz. If I can say 1, 2, 3, 4 in 1 second, then that's 4 hertz. So we did, and we could look at a GSR. I think it was a galvanometer, very sensitive, you know, to current, and put it on a finger, and then put the ground like on a toe or on the other hand. So you'd get this reading, and we'd find that the body resistance increased as a person got deeper into their meditation state. So we could see that the current flow got less and less and less and less. But we'd see this needle then start to sit there and vibrate. We'd ask the person, what's going on? And they'd say, oh, that's where I got the 4 hertz oscillation. So the body was actually also oscillating, not physically moving around, but its conductivity
and did you
was oscillating. Yeah, oh yeah, I felt the vibrations. Vibrations were always strong, sometimes very strong. Eventually, they kind of just become signposts.
Yeah.
When you get in that vibration state, you say, "Oh, good." That's when it starts to get good. Is when you hit that nice mellow vibration state, and it was always a good sign that you were on the right track and about already, almost there.
Yeah. How do you explain this vibration? Because it could it can be quite frightening when we're in the middle of.
It tends to be, when you first sense it, it tends to be a bit frightening because you put your focus on it. What was that? Oh, I'm vibrating. Oh, I'm vibrating more. Oh, it's more. Oh, help. It gets to be scary. But what happens, I believe, is that when you get in this vibration state is when your mind lets go of interpreting this physical reality. In other words, when you're lying there, you're thinking, okay, I feel myself, I'm in a bed, I feel the bed, I feel the pressure on my back. Or if you're sitting in a chair, I can feel my feet, I can feel my shoes, I can feel the things that are on my body, and you're still there. You're in the room. You may be able to hear humming of wires or slushing of pipes, or there's things you can hear, and you're aware of all of that stuff. And I think when you let go of that, because you can be kind of aware of it but not paying attention to it, but you're still aware of it. But when you drop it to where you're no longer aware of it, well, you've just dropped out of this reality. You just stop processing the data that defines this reality. Remember, this reality is a virtual reality. You get a data stream and you interpret it to be this physical reality. When you stop interpreting that data, well, you're not in Kansas anymore. You're not in this reality anymore. You stopped interpreting the data that creates this virtual reality. When you do that, what happens, I think, is that the body suddenly doesn't have anything to process, there's nothing to process, nothing to calibrate by. It's like sometimes if you're floating, you don't know whether you're which way's north, which way's south, which way's up, which way's down. If you're kind of floating, in water, you get disoriented. So I think what happens is you have all kinds of things in the body that are like servo systems. The nerves, if they're not getting a signal, they get more sensitive. And if they're still not getting a signal, they get more sensitive. But then maybe they stop there and they go someplace else looking for more signal. You just don't get more sensitive all over. It searches. So I think what happens is and all these muscles, of course, are like servo systems. You drive your hand to go this way until your hand's gone too far, and then you stop it. So your servo system says, move like this. Oh, you've gone too far, move back. That's it, too far, and I'll move forward. Then you zone in on what you're trying to do. So those servo systems they get data. They get data all the time. You're getting data from physical reality. In that data, you're converting it into the physical world, and suddenly the data's gone. And it's like, where's my data? So it starts searching. Where am I? Where's the physical world? So your little servers are going, well, it's not there, it's not here, So you start vibrating in a sense that your servo systems are looking for input.
Yeah, I think
your body, your muscles, your mind, everything's looking for input, and there is no input. So you get that stuff are just the natural frequency of your body left without input.
A metaphor of this could be the noise between two radio stations. When you jump from a radio station to another, this kind of noise where there is no
that's static. That's static that's not being made by man. That's just natural static that's out there. I think that's a little different. This, I believe, is just your body's reaction to losing the data stream that defines the reality that it's in. Okay, so you're used to getting data. You're in this reality. Your body's adjusted to that. And in moving in this reality, your body and central nervous system are constantly getting inputs, eyes, ears, taste, balance. I mean, everything is just constantly pointing, whether you're aware of it or not. You may not be aware of it. You may not be paying any attention to it, but it's happening all the time. You don't have to look at your feet to walk, it just happens. So all this stuff just happens naturally. And when your mind turns that data stream off, suddenly your body just doesn't have any input data anymore. So it starts searching for data. And in that data search, it ends up being this oscillation. So I think that's just Tom Campbell's opinion of what that oscillation is. I haven't been able to come up with anything any better, but that is just my opinion. Most people get it. It's very common. And often people get thing that I call fear tests. If you're going to go out of body and you're very fearful, it's a bad idea because you're just going to get scared. Things are going to happen to you that'll frighten you more. And instead of growing up, which means getting rid of your fear, you're just going to add more fear with the fear you already have. So it's not going in the right direction. So if you are too fearful, then you shouldn't do that because you'll end up with more fear. That's de-evolution.
Yeah.
You want to evolve to less fear. So often the system will give you a test to see, are you ready? And if you scream and run away because you're fearful, you're not ready. So you'll keep getting those tests until you get to the point that, some big monster runs over and says he wants to eat you. And you just say, how you doing, guy? What's up? And you just ignore them and interact with them, and suddenly, they're gone. There are no monsters that live over there. That's silliness. But if you're afraid of them, then you end up having to fight and doing all this martial arts junk. And, that's just what's going on in your mind. That's a person that's really not ready yet, who runs into all that fear when they go out of body. They need to they need to get rid of some of their fears first before they do that. Because once you don't have so much fear, then that pulsation state, can be used as a fear test. It'll just flap you so like you're a flag in a high wind. And it gets to be more than most people can stand, and they jump out. Well, if you just let it go and say, okay, I'm going to ride this bucking bronco till I wear it out. Let it jump. That's all right. I just jump with it.
Yeah.
And eventually it says, okay, you're not afraid. And it settles down. And then after that, you don't get the strong stuff. You just get the little signpost that says, yeah, you're on the right spot. You're on the launch pad. Go whenever you're ready, launch when ready. That vibration state is like the launch pad. And that's what it means. So Dennis and I did these things. We were really interested in evidential, because everything else was irrelevant to us. After a couple of years of that, we literally had enough statistics that, it was 1 in, a million that we were imagining things and not actually seeing and hearing and doing things, because the evidence said that we were accurate. Most of the time we were accurate, not all the time. So then I wanted to investigate, well, why is it that some of the time you're not accurate? So I started to understand how the consciousness, how the mind works relative to what you get, what you see, what's really going on there, how the mind works. So I started studying the paranormal things by changing variables. So if you wonder, how do you gain scientific knowledge from going out of body? Well, the way you do that is first you learn to get fairly good at doing something paranormal, like remote viewing or healing or something that can be measured, finding things that are measurable. And then if you get good at that to where you're very confident that you can do it whenever you want, then you change a variable. Say, okay, I'm going to change this variable. And the variable may mean how long it takes you to get into that state. The variable could be the kind of food you eat before you go into that state. You know, there's lots of variables. There's tons of variables, and you change a variable, you repeat, see what your result is. Were you just as able to do it, more able, less able? Change another variable, raise that variable a little more. Anyway, you just keep doing that methodically. Took me close to 35 years of doing that. I spent 35 years looking at variables, changing them, coming to conclusions. Oh, I see what affects what. Okay, now, you know, what if I keep all of those variables steady, but I change this one? So eventually you come to the conclusion that you understand how the paranormal works, what its rules are, why when it doesn't work, why that's the case. Mm-hmm. Your mind has to be very precisely open in order to open to these intuitive states. It can't just be open, closed, open, closed, open, open, closed. You know, it can't be out of control. You have to be able to say open, stay open. Be aware of what you get, have an intention, get a result, bring back, go back here, check the result. Go back, get your attention open, and you find out that there's lots of variables. One variable is sugar. I found out that if I ate sugar, any kind of sweetener, before a session, I'd have a lot harder time. It doesn't make the session not work, but it just made it a lot more difficult. It was hard to focus. And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, well, that makes sense. Your brain uses glucose as energy. If the energy that drives most of your thinking is in flux all the time, going up and down because you eat a candy bar, you do this and that, you know what that does? It drives your sugar levels up. They stay up for about 15 minutes after you're done, and then boom, they shoot down. They shoot too far. Insulin comes on and says, whoa, we got to cut that off. Insulin almost always overshoots. Now you got too little. So now you have problems for the too little. So now the insulin turns on the other way, and then you got too much. So what happens is the sugar in your system rings just like you ring a circuit in a double E. You're ringing a circuit means that you throw a big pulse into it, and it has to damp out. So the sugar is ding, 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 ding. You know, it damps out over a certain amount of time. It levels out if there's nothing else going on. Well, my research showed that signal takes about 4 hours to damp out. So if in the meantime, you know, you eat something that's got sugar or carbohydrate that turns very quickly to sugar, then, and if you do that every 2 or 3 hours, your system never settles out. Your system's just, your sugar levels are doing this. And then I realized after some more research that if I stopped the sugar altogether, my mind got much clearer. I could think better. My attention was clearer. My focus was better. Everything was clearer. And then I realized because the glucose in my brain was steady. So it'd be like trying to play football on a football field that was constantly changing elevations, you know, sometimes downhill, then suddenly uphill, then suddenly a hole, and suddenly a mountain. You know, I mean, if you're trying to function precisely, and we were trying to isolate very precise states that are pretty subtle. And if your playing field is all over the place, well, that's hard. If your playing field is nice and perfectly level, then a little bump is noticeable. So that was the thing. So I took, it probably took the best part of a year to do just the research just on sugar, and found out that if I cut out all kinds of sweeteners, natural, unnatural, didn't matter, all kinds of sweeteners, then my thinking was a lot clearer, a lot more precise. It's like the fog was lifted. You know, in the old days, we used to take, if you had a cold, you take an antihistamine, but the antihistamines would always make you drowsy. It's only about 30 years ago did they have non-drowsy antihistamines, but the antihistamines would make you drowsy. So yeah, you had a cold and you were miserable, but at least you could understand what people were talking about and follow a conversation. You took the antihistamines, it was like your head turned to cotton, and you like sit and stare at a wall or something. You weren't good for anything. So it was like that. It was like, stop taking an antihistamine. The clarity suddenly appeared. And so I changed my diet.
Yeah.
And so it was just lots of things, took a long time to do, but eventually I knew what affected what and why.
Yeah.
The mental state not only has to be stable, but it has to be precise. If you've got other thoughts coming in, if you've got a worry or something that's nagging at you, or you and your wife just had an argument before you came to do this, it affects your state. You have to come here and take everything else in your mind, set it aside.
Yeah.
Your mind has to go there and be blank and steady and be able to hold that blank, steady space. Now, this is the meditation path, right? Hold that blank, steady state for as long as you wanted to, for an hour, for 2 hours. You could just be there with not a single stray thought coming through your mind. Well, when you had that kind of clarity, then doing the paranormal things was much easier and more reliable. As soon as your mind started jumping around, then you'd get errors. You wouldn't get the right answers. When you do a query to the database, this is how the remote viewing works, is all the information's in a database. You basically query the database and you get an answer. So when you query the database is thousands of times faster than Google. You get something back instantly. It's like the thought has barely left your mind when the answer is already into your mind. So that takes a while to figure out, because if you say, all right, I'm going to throw it out there. I've got it. All right, now let me take a deep breath and get ready for the answer. The answer already came before you even got your deep breath. You missed it. It's gone. So then you say, what answer? I didn't get an answer. Well, you did get an answer, but you were too slow to find it. So if you have little things that zip through your mind, well, you think they're your answer, but they're not. It's just something that zipped through your mind. Yeah. So just, lots of things like that you learn over time. So your mind has to be clear. It can't be bumped around. It you need that discipline. Now, when you go the other route, like through Tom's Park, and you figure discipline's too hard for me, I can't do it, then you go this route with the imagination, and it's a different path. It's a totally different path, but it'll take you there just the same. You can get there in the same way, but you actually are learning to discipline your imagination. You still need discipline. You can't get there without discipline, but disciplining your imagination is a lot easier than disciplining your thoughts. Disciplining your mind tends to be hard for people because they've never tried it, because they've ignored their intuitive side for so long. They just don't have any skills at it. But everybody uses their imagination. So getting the discipline at the imaginary level is not as hard for most people as it is to get it at the intellectual level. Yeah. So those are the things I did. So I did that for 35 years. And at the end of 35 years, I thought, well, I know enough to really write a good text on what is consciousness and how does consciousness affect everything else. And I knew that the physical reality was a product of consciousness. And how does that work? And I knew that too. And I published the books, and about 2 years later, I realized, that's how quantum physics works. And that's how relativity works. And then I said, gee, I wonder what else I can figure out how it works. And then all of these paradoxes that are hanging around in science all fell out logically. Yeah. Together. They can all, they all can be easily explained. The reason they're paradoxes is just that the scientists don't have any idea how reality actually works. That's why they remain as paradoxes. So yes, I'm a physicist, and I've gone about my work diligently and with a lot of rigor, because I know that it's easy in mental space to talk yourself into anything. You can imagine anything, and if you give yourself an award for imagining that, then pretty soon, you can walk yourself down la la land and will be, lost in an undisciplined imagination that thinks it's got something real when it doesn't. So I've always was very aware of that as a downside, an obstacle to be avoided. So it was always, we had to be logical, we had to have the data, we had to do things that were evidential. It wasn't a matter of just getting better at gut hunches. It was a matter of doing things over and over and over again and collecting the data. So that's how I worked. Now, Dennis and I then started at the same time, worked together. And at one time, which is, I think, something you were hinting at, it's in the book 1, which is really just a little story about, me going out to the lab. Dennis and I were told by Bob, Bob's in a control room. Our setup was, then there were 3 soundproof booths. Dennis was in number 3, I was in number 1. So it was an empty one between us. And if we had screamed at the top of our lungs, we may have heard a little squeak from the other one, because the soundproofing was really pretty solid. And there was a whole soundproof booth between us. So we couldn't hear each other, but we had a microphone that was hung down just at our lips. And we could talk very quietly, because when you're in that state, you can't talk anyway other but very quietly. And we talked very quietly to tell Bob what we were experiencing. Because if he didn't know what we were experiencing, then there wasn't any way for him to help us. So that was the lab protocol. So he taught us to go into these states and talk at the same time. So we would experience things. It was kind of a running, here's what I'm experiencing now, here's what's going on. I just meant this entity. It's, he says his name's George, and Bob would ask questions.
This is incredible.
Because when you're in that state, you're not very intellectual. You're intuitive. Well, instead of saying, oh, George, where do you come from? What do you do? Why are you out here? What's you? Here's why I'm here. What's going on? Your intellect's just sitting there going, oh, hi, George. Your intellect is not really functioning because you left it behind. You're intuitive. So everything that you get about George is all just intuitive stuff. You can intuit a lot about him, but you don't think to ask much to develop facts about George that maybe you could look up later to see if there was a guy George and if the things he told you were actually true. So we're looking for information. So Bob would be listening, and we had a headset on, so he could talk to us individually, or if he threw another switch, he could talk to us both together. But he usually just talked to us individually. And we both had data streams running to him, so he had both of us talking to him, probably more or less at the same time. And he could sort that out. He was good at sorting out several conversations, and then he would throw a switch, talk to me, talk to Dennis, ask a question, ask George, this, and this, and if he knows anything about these subjects. If he does, we'd like to know about those subjects. So anyway, Bob had his intellect. He's sitting there with the intellect in full blossom. So he'd ask us to ask them, and then we'd report back. And there's literally hundreds and hundreds of these explorer tapes. We were called explorers, and you can go to Monroe Institute and find the old explorer tapes, and you can find some of them of Tom Campbell. At that time I was in my 20s, and I was out there experiencing things, and Bob's asking questions, and that was the kind of stuff we did. Well, one evening we got there, and Bob said, I've got a new experiment to try. He says, I want you and Dennis to go out of body, meet above the lab up in the air someplace, and then go on an adventure together. But you got to stay together. So make that part of your intent, that you must stay together. Yeah. So when you wink off into some other reality frame, do it together. So we didn't know whether it would work or not. So we did it. We'd gone up above the lab. This was easy at this time. You could go out of body and do whatever you wanted. So we went up above the lab and hung out. And, oh, yeah, there we were. And we said, okay, ready to go? He says, all right, together. And both of us thought together. And then we just let it go. And we found ourselves in some other reality frame as usual. And we're talking about it. Now, do you see this? Do you see that? Yeah, I see that. Well, what do you think about this other thing? You mean that red thing? Yeah, the red thing. What do you think about that? So we were just talking, having conversations, and it was long. It took about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And At the end of the 2 hours, Bob stopped it and got us back, and we got out of our booths and got up, and he said, well, do you two guys think you were together? And we looked at each other and said, yeah, it seemed like it. We were together. And he said, okay, well, listen to this. So he had rewound Dennis's tape and rewound my tape, things that we had said. Mm-hmm. And it was a tape of our talk. And he turned them both on at the same time, so they'd be in time. They'd be synchronized in time. And there was Dennis and I having conversations, answering each other's questions, obviously talking to each other in reasonable, reasonable sentences. So it was like, well, we were together. You can't have a conversation with somebody else. So of course we were in these separate booths. None of that was physical. It all was being done in a non-physical level. And we went on this adventure, and oh, did you see that red thing over there? Oh, you mean the little thing right past the spire where the tower is? Yeah, that's the thing I mean. And so we obviously were together in and out of body. And that was big for me. It wasn't as big for Dennis. For Dennis, it was just another weird day at the lab. We do these things all the time. So it's like we'd have these kinds of really out there experiences every night. Yeah. We were coming out to the lab, 15 to 20 hours. We'd come out like at 6 o'clock at night. We'd start working there at about 6:30, 7, building equipment stuff. Bob would come up about 8 or 9. We'd get in the booth, and we'd stay in those booths till 10 or 11, 12. At midnight, we go down to Bob's house, and we all sit around and talk about it, try to figure out what we could learn from what happened and whatever. So 2 o'clock in the morning, we're back on the motorcycle, headed home. Get home at 2 o'clock in the morning, go to bed, and practice, because you're all geared up. You've had all this exciting stuff going on up until 2 o'clock. So you go back, get in bed, and you kind of pick up where you left off. At least I did. And I started playing with it. Then it would be about 4 o'clock in the morning. A couple hours, you're going to have to get up. So I try to stop, sleep for 2 hours, get up, go to work. Then you'd work for 8 hours. After supper, you'd get on a motorcycle, you get back out to Bob's, come home at 2 o'clock, work on it until 5, sleep from 5 to 7, get up, go to work. And, so I was getting about 2 hours of sleep a night and doing this. So it was a rather intensive time doing this. So the mental state, I guess, got a little blurred. There was, but it was fun. I learned a lot. And
did you experience some altered state of consciousness during the day?
Oh, yeah, sometimes. And what I found out is that I could work. I was a lot smarter if I wasn't trying to solve the problem than if I was trying to solve the problem. If you just, it's like you have this problem and you're not quite sure how to even start it, how to solve it or whatever. But when you're in that altered state, solutions would just come to you. Mm-hmm. You didn't have to figure out the solution. It'd just be there. It'd be right in front of your eyes. Look, just do that, start with that. And you go, well, why should I start with that? So just start with it, So you'd start with it, and the thing would start to unravel, and the solution would start to, things would start to fall apart the way you wanted them. So I found out that with an intuitive state, working with an intellectual state, that I could solve problems that I wouldn't have been able to solve nearly as easily or as quickly as I could before. And eventually I left that job, went to another job, and got a reputation for being able to solve very large, complex problems that other people didn't even know how to start to solve. But that's what I had. I could do it from an intuitive spot rather than from an intellectual spot. Intellectually, there were 300 variables, and you had no idea, how to start a problem with 300 variables. Everything affected everything else, and how do you deal with that? But I was able to come up with solutions for those problems that usually worked. Yeah. So I eventually quit my job and became a consultant. Mm-hmm. And had plenty of work and lots of fun. because once I quit my job, I didn't have to go to staff meetings. I didn't have all that, that bothersome political stuff to do. I just do my work. I'd have like 5 or 6, I call them kids, but they were often fresh outs, kids that just got out of college or sometimes graduate school, mostly programmers. I'd write equations, they'd program them. And I could have 5, 6 programmers going all at once, all on different aspects of the same problem. And I have them all going at the same time. So that was fun. And it was a lot of fun because my boss and my boss's bosses had no idea what I was doing. And if they asked, there really wasn't any way I could explain it to them. So they just had to have some faith. And every week or every other week, I have to send them something that showed progress. Yeah, because so they kept seeing progress. Oh, we're able to calculate this now, or now we can calculate that. And so they were seeing progress. So basically, they stopped asking and just left me alone. So it was me and my kids, who were all my programmers, and we just had a good time. We had fun, and I helped them, they helped me. Sometimes I'd send them some equations, and they say these equations don't work. And I look at it and I go, oh yeah, I forgot a term, and I'd put something in it. We work together, and I'd say, oh, this code doesn't work. That's not the right answer. And they'd find it. So we'd help debug each other's stuff, and and we all had a good time. So they would work, and eventually I'd come out with an answer and a solution. Mm-hmm. And of course I'd have to test it against real world data to see if I could get the answer of an actual problem that was already done and understood. And I always was real good with that. I could come out, I could hit them right on the nose. Mm-hmm. And then if you do that, you build credibility in here's a problem that's unknown. We don't know how it's going to come out. That's why we're asking you to do the problem. So then you have confidence in that, because you do the problems of things that are known and you're able to solve them. So I did that for another decade and a half, 2 decades. And it was fun, because the thing about working that's not fun is the politics. So I was a manager before, and I gave up the management. I gave up people. Me and the kids would work together and make products. So what we were doing was making computer models of very complex systems. Mm-hmm. And that was the way it worked. So anyhow, that's what I did with it. That's how it interfaces with your work world. With your work world, if you're also intuitive, you're a lot smarter than if you're just an intellectual and don't have any intuition. Yes. Most of the really hard problems, you solve them intuitively, not intellectually, because you don't have enough information to solve them intellectually, and you're stuck and you don't know how to proceed. No way seems like it's a way to an answer. But intuitively, there are usually solutions that, even if you don't know how it's going to work out in the end, you just do it because you've done it 100 times before, and it always works out in the end. So you just do it, and then one thing leads to another, and pretty soon you've got a solution. And then sometimes they'd ask me, they say, well, how did you know to approach the problem that way? And I'd say, it just seemed like a good thing, a good way to start. I don't know. It just seemed like a good way to start. But one thing would open up the next thing, which would open up the next thing. And pretty soon you had this thing. Now, they were really complex. My first models that I did when Dennis and I worked at the same place before I moved, I had programs that would run all through the day shift, all through the night shift, and I'd get all of the night shift. I'd probably get 60% of the day shift, because other things had more priority than mine, because if they didn't, nothing else would run for the whole organization except my program. It would blot everybody else out. Once it got hold of the machine, it would never let it loose. So I got lower priority, but I get maybe 60% of the day, 100% of the second shift, 100% of the third shift. And I would do that for about 3 months of that. I get one answer. So the computers were so slow in those days that it took me about 3 months per calculation, which was tediously slow. But today, shoot, everybody's cell phone is faster than that. Today, computers are thousands of times faster, but that was one of IBM's big crunchers that we had. And it wasn't even as fast as your cell phone. Not even your old flip cell phone was probably faster than that.
Yeah.
So that was the tedious, but yeah, there were real complex things that needed a lot of computer power to do them. But if the answer was important enough, people could wait for it. Otherwise, they couldn't get it. Like an answer was, here's this radar system that has this anti-spoof software and hardware, and there's no way to beat it. It'll always follow you. If you try to lead it off, it'll come back. You can't jam it. You can't spoof it. It's spoof proof. So how do you beat it? How do we make it go away from, showing the enemy our stuff? Okay, so I get problems like that. So I'd find ways that I could create little tiny errors inside their electronical signal processing software and hardware. And then I could introduce another little error that would add to the last little error, and introduce another little error that would add to those two. So the thing would sit there and it would be like a monster. It wouldn't be able to let go. And then suddenly it would just go and wander off and just, go off looking at something totally fabricated. It was, you could have the errors with inside their own equipment build progressively. And in order to find a way to do that, it was just trial and error.
Yeah.
Because that equipment wasn't anything that we could get our hands on. It was stuff that was, done with micro tubes. It wasn't even solid state then. So we didn't even go to micro tubes in this country. So that's when I was working for Army Technical Intelligence. We'd do things like that. Yeah. So we could solve those problems if you could make an accurate enough model of their signal processing and of their radar system and of all the electronics in their system and the way they did it. So we'd set out the collection requirements to our network of spies to try to collect documentation that would give us this specific kind of information. Our spies would try to get it. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes it was just too hard to get. And anyway, it was that kind of a game working for Army Technical Intelligence. If they get us some of the information we know, like how do they make those little tubes? Well, those tubes are also on radios and TVs and other things, so you could get that kind of information. So eventually we got enough information that we could figure out trial and error. Yeah. So I just go through all kinds of signal input forms and whatever. And finally, I just made one up. Says, this one's crazy. Let's see what it does. And it worked, at least a little bit. So then I made it work a little better, work a little better, work a little better until I optimized it. And then, go try this. And it worked. So that's the kind of work that I was doing then.
Thank you.
Which was fun.
Yeah. I have a final question. It's kind of a philosophical question. After all these years of exploring the different states of consciousness, what insights has Tom the avatar gained about Tom the player and vice versa?
Well, you gain lots of insights as you go. One is that when you start, you realize that you can use your intent to modify future probability, and you get good at that, which means you can make sure that There are no surprises, and most everything in your life is just the way you like it. You know, you seldom get surprises, and the bad stuff just goes around you and doesn't ever settle on you, and the good stuff comes and drops at your feet as you need it. So you can kind of make your life charmed that way. And when you first start out, you sort of do that in the beginning just to see if you can. And when you realize that you can, you quit and say, it's no fun. You've just gotten in your own way. You've created a bubble around yourself that isolates you from life, isolates you from randomness, from things happening. And in which case you stop making choices. You don't have any tough choices to make. You've rearranged your life so that all your choices are easy. It's just the choice you want. So you stop learning, you stop growing because you're not being challenged anymore. So eventually you throw all that away. You say, I don't want to do that. You know, if you have a headache, you just keep the headache. You don't get rid of it. If you have this or that, you know, you skin your knee, well, you deal with it. You learn. What's the lesson from the skinned knee? You know, well, look where you're going. You know, that's the lesson. Whereas before, you didn't have to look where you're going. Your feet would always just put themselves in the right places so that everything would work fine. Somebody else may step in a hole, but you would always walk around it because you were just keeping those negative things from happening. So, you know, that's one thing that, you know, you change about yourself is you stop using it to your advantage. You let it go. You stop using it to the advantage of others as much as you can. But people always come. Tom, my mother's sick. Can you help? So I do things like that. Some when I'm asked, but I know in the bigger picture, it's helping in the little picture. Somebody's mother gets better. In the big picture, it's not helping. Mm-hmm. It's manipulating things that really don't need to be manipulated. All things there because that's where they are. That's the result of all the choices made, of all the things that have happened, of all the randomness that's occurred. That's just the way it is. And to try to go through life changing all that to suit you is a bad idea. And changing it to suit other people is also not a good idea. You need to look at life as stuff happens and you get to deal with it. And what the stuff is that happens isn't even that important. Whether you step in a hole or don't step in a hole isn't important. What's important is how you deal with it. Whether you get bitten by a rattlesnake or you don't get bitten by a rattlesnake isn't that important. It's how do you deal with it? That's important. By dealing with it in a positive way, you learn something. And you can be an example for other people to learn things. If you avoid everything unpleasant, then you don't learn anything and you don't help anybody else learn anything. So that's one of the lessons of this path is that people who become very adept at manipulation quit if they're on a path to growing up. They don't use the paranormal stuff anymore after they get good at using it because it's dysfunctional to do that. It doesn't really help you. Everything is the result of all the choices you've ever made. That's why you are who you are here now. It's all the choices that have ever made, along with the random stuff that comes in. And you have to deal with that. And sometimes that's hard. Sometimes it's excruciatingly difficult. Sometimes it's pleasant. But dealing with it positively is what really life's about. If you can deal with it positively means in a way that not only serves you, but serves everyone else too. Dealing with it positively, then you grow up, you evolve. When you evolve, you get a bigger decision space. You mentioned that word earlier. That's all the choices that you know that you have, that you're able to understand that you have. There's probably double that number of choices that you actually do have, but you don't know about them. Those are in choices that are, if you're all intellectual, there's a lot of intuitive choices you have that you don't know anything about. But there's intellectual choices you don't know about too. We usually don't know what all our choices are. That's why we go talk to a professional. Professionals give us a bigger array of choices that we never thought of. You say, that's That's why. So anyway, the more you grow up, the bigger your decision space gets. The bigger your decision space gets, the better usually your decisions get, because now you have more information. That enables you to understand more. You can take in more. You can make better choices. Your decision space keeps growing. So your decision space grows. For the average person walking around on our planet today, their decision space is just a small space in front of their face. You know, it's their life and the things they know about that are in it. That's it. So it's the little world, the little world that is a calculation. It's the little virtual reality that they're in. That's all they see. As you get to see beyond that, you see the subjective world as well, and that's much bigger. It's a much bigger, richer world. So you begin to see the subjective world. You begin to have connection to other people. You understand what other people are thinking and what they're feeling, how they react to what it is you're saying. You understand how you react to what they're saying. So all of this becomes obvious to you, when before, well, you'd talk to people and they just say whatever they said. You'd say whatever you said, and the stuff would either work or it wouldn't work. But eventually you understand that person, where they're coming from, what they're thinking, how they're feeling, why they say the things they say. If you need more specific information, this comes out of the database, and right there it is. So you know a lot more, so that the choices you make and the things that you say can be more helpful, because you understand the problem better, which just opens your decision space a little more. You've got a much larger array of information to deal with, and about people and about situations. So somebody says something and that makes most people angry. It doesn't make you angry. Matter of fact, anger disappears. You're never angry. You're never upset. Things don't bother you. Yes, even this nasty world we live in, with all the greedy people all trying to use each other for their own best interest, even that doesn't make you angry. You just realize that's the way it is. That's the quality of consciousness, the way it is today. So that's the way we act, because that's the way we are. And we get to live in it because that's the way we are. That won't change until we grow up. Sure, you can get rid of that nasty dictator, get rid of that cheating politician, but it won't make any difference. That cheating politician will be replaced with another cheating politician eventually, until the average level of consciousness quality rises, the level of entropy in the consciousness system decreases. Then you don't have to get rid of that bad dictator and that cheating politician. They'll all just disappear. They won't be there. Over time, they'll just disappear. Good people, people with good attitudes will replace those. But that's only until people with good attitudes are the majority of the people. So the way to save the world and make the world a better place is to save yourself and make yourself a better person. And that works out really advantageously, because you're the only person that you can change. You can't change anybody else. So it works out really great. The only person you can change is the exact person you need to change. And you stop trying to change other people, let them be. Oh, that's awful. That's stupid. That's counterproductive. Stop that. That's just the way they are. They see the world differently, because they have a whole different set of criteria and experiences than you have. Everybody lives in their own reality. There is not a reality out there. There's the virtual reality we live in, but everybody makes that virtual reality out of their own interpretation of the data stream. So even though there's a virtual reality, every individual makes their own interpretation of it. So we all walk around in our own reality. It's a multiplayer game. So yes, things I do affect you, things you do affect me. So there's shared data, just like in the Sims, there's shared data in the Sims virtual reality, or the World of Warcraft virtual reality. But what we think is real comes out of our own choices. and everybody's choices are different. So if there's 8 billion people on this planet, there's 8 billion different viewpoints of reality. 18 billion different realities that are all interacting with each other. So those people are just in a different reality than you are. And in their reality, what you think is good is bad. And what you think is bad is good. And that's how their reality works. Why? Probably because they're fearful. They're very fearful people. They find fearful things. Anything that's scary, they believe it. The uglier and scarier it is, the easier it is to believe, because they're fearful people. You can't change it till change us. Can't change them, so you change yourself. If you change yourself, that will flow, that will help other people change. It's just being near somebody who's higher quality than you are helps pull you up. And being near people that are lower quality than you are drags you down. That's how mobs form. That mob will do more damage and uglier things as a mob than any one of the people in the mob would ever have done by themselves. Yeah. Because together they pull each other down. Well, the antithesis of that is, nice people, good people, low quality, high quality, low entropy people. Well, if you're around those people, they pull you up. Works the same way. We have collective consciousness. We haven't talked about collective consciousness, but that's a thing too. So we are kind of running out of time.
Yeah.
We've done our 2.5 hours here.
It's so interesting, and there is so much topic we could explore. But really, thank you, Tom. I really wanted to thank you on behalf of the ASTRALFLIX community and the time you gave us. It was really a pleasure, and I hope we will stay in touch.
Okay. If any of your readers out there want to know more, I've got a website at www.mybigtoe with hyphens between each one of those, my-big-toe. There's lots of videos on YouTube. I've got thousands of hours of videos on YouTube covering every possible subject. I've also got a search tool that allows you to put specific things that you want to look at in the search tool, and it'll tell you what videos have those things in them. So that's a search tool, but you can find all that stuff on the website. If you want some of the science, there's a what's it? Not a reading list, but some sort of list, playlist. There's a playlist that just has science stuff in it. If you want the how does this MBT do science? So if you just take 6 months or a year just to fiddle around and all that stuff, then you'll learn an awful lot. Then come back, we'll do it again.
Oh yes, I will put the links on the video.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome, Imad. It's been my pleasure. I hope it helps you and your listeners.
Oh yes, it helped me so much. I learned a lot. And yes, I bought the MSync binaural beats. It's a great tool. I had great experience with.
Did you buy it now HemiSync, or did you buy my binaural beats?
Your binaural beats on
my
MB.
binaural beats. Yeah. There's two. I ask you a question, and there's 2 sections of those. One that run from 512 down to 32, and another one that go from 32. They match. They match it like in the low range, and the other ones are at the high range. Did you get both sets?
Yes, I had both sets, but I felt quite comfortable with the. I don't remember the numbers, but the first tracks, like 8 and 12 maybe.
In the high range or the low range? Do you remember?
I think it's a high range. But there was a mix of different I felt I don't know anything about this technology, so I felt that it changed along the recording.
It does. There's lots of changes in there. It's a pretty complex audio, but I work it with different bass frequencies. You know, the bass frequency, and then you have the difference between the bass frequencies is the beat frequency.
Yeah.
So I use different bass frequencies, and sometimes I change the bass frequencies in the middle of the what that does is it helps keep you from falling asleep.
Yeah.
It's helped keeps you from losing your consciousness altogether. As things change up a little bit, they provide something for you to notice. Because if you go for a long time without noticing anything, you tend to fall asleep. Yeah. So I have a lot of changes which keeps you engaged and keeps you changed, but there's an underlying structure that's mainly running around a 4 hertz binaural beat, drops down to a 2 hertz beat for no more than 2 minutes, and then jumps back up to a 4, and then every once in a while there's a spike that goes up to 8 and back down again, but it makes that whole trip in 30 seconds or less.
Yeah.
So it's a real fast, run up, right back down again in 30 seconds. And that's a wake up. What it does is takes you out of the very deepest states, brings you up just a little bit, enough for you to say, oh, well, what am I doing? What's my purpose here? You kind of get reoriented, and then it takes you back again. So it's got a lot of things going on inside, but most people find those to be very effective.
Yeah, it's very effective, and also the state you are in, even when you meditate after without binaural beats, you start to notice the texture of the state. So without you can feel that you are in the same zone that you are with the beats.
That's good.